Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with Nancy Princenthal and Kristina Parsons, part of the program series, New York Between Art and Life. This talk is presented in conjunction with the exhibition, New York 1962 to 1964, on view at the Jewish Museum through January 8th, 2023. The Mildred and George Weissman program has been endowed by Paul, Ellen, and Dan Weissman in honor of their parents, and we are grateful for their support of the museum's programming. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. Nancy Princenthal is the author of Agnes Martin, Her Life and Art, which received the 2016 PEN Jacqueline Bograd-Weld Award for Biography. Her other books include Unspeakable Acts, Women, Art, and Sexual Violence in the 1970s, and Hannah Wilkie. A contributing editor of Art in America, she has also written for the New York Times, Hyperallergic, Bomb, and Elsewhere, as well as in other artist monographs and catalogs. Princenthal has lectured widely and taught at Bard College, Princeton University, Yale University, and the School of Visual Arts. Kristina Parsons is the Leon Levy Assistant Curator at the Jewish Museum. Her research centers around material culture, technology, and migration in the 20th century. Parsons has worked on exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art and the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And most recently, Jewish Museum exhibitions Jonas Mekas, The Camera Was Always Running, and New York 1962 to 1964. It is my pleasure to welcome her to begin this talk.
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Nancy, for making time to speak with us about your research. You are such a wealth of knowledge, and it is really an absolute pleasure to be able to discuss your work in greater detail today alongside the subject of our exhibition. As viewers and listeners of our conversation will know, our talk is precipitated by the Jewish Museum's current exhibition, New York 1962-1964, which looks back at our own institutional history when the museum's director, Alan Solomon, was organizing a series of exhibitions which really championed this emerging generation of artists living and working in New York City, and transformed the museum really into this key hub for contemporary art in the city. And this is certainly the starting place for our exhibition, but our show and this project also looks more broadly at the context of this 3-year period to explore all of the really diverse and heterogeneous approaches to art practice that were being cultivated. And part of an institutional revisiting such as this project, a big part of that is to use our privilege of our contemporary position to correct some of the biases and oversights of the past. And I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that often those artists that were excluded are women artists. And I will also note that in the series of exhibitions that Solomon organized at the Jewish Museum during his tenure, for example, only Miriam Shapiro and Lee Bonteque were included among those artists. One of the important parts of our approach to organizing this exhibition is to highlight some of the incredible artists of this period who have been underrepresented in art historical discourse, and use our platform to really put a spotlight on their work and just how incredibly important it was. And this, of course, brings me to just one of the many ways in which, Nancy, your research is really beautifully aligned with our own, your research on the Coenties Slip community of artists, which is highlighted in part in your wonderful book, Agnes Martin, Her Life and Art, which I really enjoyed reading, and brings so many of these artists, their personal connections, the intimate ways in which their art is connected to one another, supported one another by one another. It really brings it to life and to the foreground. So I was hoping that for our conversation today, perhaps we could start with you introducing who this community was, who was involved, and a little bit about them.
Thank you, Kristina, so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. It's such a pleasure to help elucidate and celebrate this amazing show at the Jewish Museum, which deservedly has gotten a fair amount of attention. I'm happy to see it. It was indeed a fantastically exciting time in New York City for the arts and more broadly. And I am going to try to screen share here. And start with this very well-known photograph by Hans Nemeth taken in 1958 of a significant handful of the artists who made the Coenties Slip community in Lower Manhattan such an important part of the art scene at the time. We're seeing here Delphine Seyrig, Jack Youngerman, their son Duncan. Standing is Ellsworth Kelly, and off to the right, sorry, it's Robert Indiana next to Duncan. Off to the right, in her sort of preternaturally kind of part of the scene, but a little distant from the scene, is Agnes Martin. And one of the things I want to say about Coenties Slip in relationship to the Jewish Museum show is that the exhibition really celebrates the amazing vitality, cultural, political, social, and every which way of these critical few years in the early 1960s, and the excitement that was brewing in what was then a pretty uncontested cultural capital. And the Coenties Slip community sort of turned its back on all that. It was a community that was really significantly apart. It, as you can see from this photograph, it celebrated or it embraced the history of the city. The buildings were old, the seaport was still functioning and thriving. Its proximity to the Wall Street community meant that that at night it was completely dead to the world. So it was really quite an isolated community. Among the other artists who were there at the time were Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Mark DeSufro came a little later. And one of the things that Jack Youngerman said at the time about the community was that we were all a bunch of Protestants from the hinterlands, as opposed to warm New York Jewish people like Rothko and Newman, which is something I couldn't resist saying for this particular program. And of course, what he's saying is, yes, Jews are a garrulous bunch of people. I feel comfortable saying that myself.
It's true that the personality of these artists and the kind of types of community and gathering, you've written about how that was a very distinct environment compared to some of the other well-known gathering spaces in New York, the 10th Street groups and the Cedar Taverns of New York.
Precisely. That's exactly. I mean, he was, in fact, although it may not sound that way, he was being tactful. What he wasn't saying is that a significant part of the community in Coenties Slip was gay, and at a time when it was not only difficult but dangerous to be out in the city, in this country. It is said that the Lavender Scare was as lethal, as dangerous as the Red Scare in the 50s and early 60s. So I am going to turn to some of the paintings that Agnes Martin and her cohort made at around this time. Martin came to New York City in 1957. She was only here for a decade. She was happier and more comfortable in New Mexico, where she spent a great deal of her life, and was born in Canada, and took the love of both the seashore and also of the wide open spaces of Saskatchewan, where she was born. She took those loves with her. She was 45 when she arrived, which contributed to a sort of misattribution of what her affinities were, artistic and also personal. And her first dealer was Betty Parsons, who made it a condition of representing her that she be in New York. So through Betty Parsons, she met the leading lights of the abstract expressionist generation, and she identified with them throughout her career for their priorities, for their expression of, as she understood it, and they did too, a kind of range of universal emotions, of universal feelings. This is a painting called The Spring, and it's from 1958. It's, I think, particularly Rothko-esque. Rothko being one of the painters that Parsons had represented. This is an assemblage from 1958 called The Laws, and it's boat spikes that are struck into an old door, and an example of her use of repurposed found things from around the seaport, boat spikes, which put her in proximity to Robert Indiana, who was down there at the time. This is a painting called The Harbor, which, as the title suggests, and as the painting suggests, is a kind of very personal, intimate representation of the harbor on a foggy day, of, sort of jostling boats at the docks of mist.
I think in this period, we really see a big restructuring of the urban environment. A lot of Robert Moses's campaigns to make automobiles a priority in the city really disconnected the city inhabitants from its waterways. And I think for contemporary researchers and viewers, this really close connection between the water and people living and working in Manhattan is somehow kind of overlooked. We forget how close and how important that environment was to these artists and the profound influence that it had.
Absolutely. And, of course, historically, the water sides of Manhattan were avoided as dirty, noisy, unhealthy places. So the Carters of wealth were in the center of the island, making loft spaces in places like the Coenties Slip community. And the slip, of course, is a nautical term for, where boats came in. A great deal of the community that's called the slip was landfill, was filled in slowly in the early history of the island. But yeah, I personally remember that seaport area from the late 60s and early 70s. And it really was quite radically apart and richly sort of redolent of the seaport that made the city the international trading post that it was. So with Little Sister, which is the small painting assemblage that is in the exhibition at the Jewish Museum, you see a kind of transition from, an assemblage like The Laws to the grids that would become her signature format in the 60s and going forward. And this is a painting in which the penciled grid is punctuated by little brass brads, little tacks, which is possibly a little hard to see in reproduction, but a crucial breakthrough for Martin. I wanted to show this painting because it falls within the time frame of the exhibition. It's called Friendship, and it's from 1963. And I think it's an anomalous painting in Martin's career. It's entirely covered with gold leaf, which was something of a feat, and has, to my mind, feel of, sort of silk shantung, of, the sort of the more fashionable, glamorous elements of New York cultural life that were seeping into the arts. And it also makes me think about Andy Warhol's Golden Marilyn of 1962, which, so, you know, just a year earlier. It's not something that Martin dwelled on, but I feel like it was an important statement for her. And I think it also speaks to her commitment to joy, her commitment to glory, and also her ambition.
I understand, just to stay on that piece for a moment, that while Betty Parsons was quite the champion of Martin, financial support was not always something that she was able to provide. Do you have a sense that obtaining so much gold leaf to cover the entire canvas such as this would have been something quite difficult? Has Martin at this point has, I think, moved on to other gallery representation, is that right?
So she had 3 exhibitions at Betty Parsons, and, you know, Betty Parsons was famous, notorious for being a fantastic supporter of important artists and a terrible businesswoman, or at least a not altogether successful businesswoman. So yeah, you know, her abstract expressionists moved on to Sidney Janis, most of them by the time that Martin started to gain attention, and Martin herself decided that it was time for her to move to Leo Castelli, which didn't work, but he recommended she try Robert Elcon, and so she did. And yeah, you know, she every penny that she made, and she certainly didn't make as much as the men who were beginning to get some success were making, went into her art. You know, she lived very frugally, and continued to do so, and really sometimes in rather dire poverty, all the way up until, you know, the early 70s, and when she began working with Arnie Glimcher at Pace Gallery, which was not until 1974. So yeah, the story of reception, the story of where the support came from, financial as well as critical, is a really important element of thinking about women's place in the arts in the 1960s in New York. This is a painting called The Tree, which both she and I are particularly enamored of. She was very, very proud of this painting, which I think beautifully expresses the sort of pumping energy of a tree, sucking nutrients up from the earth, and raining down shade and nutrients in return to everything beneath it. It was a painting that was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art soon after it was painted, which was also a point of pride for her. This is Lenore Tawney, also a resident at the Coenties Slip community, and here she is in her studio. So as you can see from this portrait, I think she was a very elegant person. She had a great gift for transforming spaces into places that had a great deal of graciousness. She was a fiber artist at a time when fiber arts were just being identified as a significant form that could cross over from the crafts to the fine arts. That crossover didn't really take place until later in the 1960s. The first fiber arts, in scare quotes, exhibition of importance was held at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in 1963. So right in the middle of, the Jewish Museum's 62 to 64 time span. Tawney and Martin were very close. They were probably romantically involved. Tawney was wealthier than Martin and actually helped support her financially early in their relationship. And of course, they also supported each other intellectually. I'm going to move forward a couple of slides to a collage that Tawney made in this period. She was as active with works on paper at this time as she was drawings as well as collages, as she was with the kinds of fiber sculptural hangings that are represented in the exhibition at the Jewish Museum. And one of the things I'm interested in, and that is really highlighted by the show, is how many of the artists at the Slip, in the Coenties Slip community, were using language. And I think that the collage, which has interwoven strips of text, as many of Tawney's collages did, relates to Robert Indiana's use of text, to, as we'll see later, to Jim Rosenquist's use of text, to Jasper Johns's grids of letters, to Rauschenberg's use of newspapers, to Chris's use of classified ads, and of course that great big single letter that we'll see in a moment. So we're also looking here at a work by Robert Indiana, who arrived at the seaport in 1956, and of course is best known for the stenciled paintings, one of which is visible here, that characterized his later career. But earlier, he was really a sculptor of found stuff, all of it salvaged, scavenged from around the seaport, just as Martin was doing at that time. We're also looking at a painting by Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin's little sister, sort of sandwiched invisibly between Tawney's wall hanging and Kelly's painting. And I think it's actually telling in some ways, because of course all through Martin's career, her paintings resisted photographic presentation. It is really hard to adequately reproduce Martin's work. In any case, one of the things that I found interesting about this particular and really striking painting by Kelly. Kelly and Martin were very close friends. Is that, of course, it's called Brooklyn Bridge, and it represents this paired spans of a bridge, but it also strikes me as resembling two parentheses. And of course, Kelly worked mostly and had done very recently more explicitly by abstracting organic forms. He had done a whole series of abstractions of water while he was in Paris before arriving at the Slip. He arrived in 1954. But the use of parentheses, if I can stick with that analogy, is also in some ways connected to print, to type, to language.
I think that's so interesting about this group of artists is the difference in their output. They shared similar working environments. They often had overlapping interests and concerns. I know Lenore, Tawney, and Agnes Martin were kind of reading buddies, reading through the lives of saints, a shared kind of interest in spiritualism, yet their output is quite different. Lenore, Tawney, and Agnes Martin are both interested in the grid in some senses, but it really manifests so differently. I know there is an instance you discuss in your book on Martin where Donald Judd, who was working at the time as an art critic and of course would soon become this very renowned minimalist artist, was discussing Martin's work as a tightly quilted surface. So, making this comparison to a textile, which is something that, Tawney is working quite closely in, but I know Martin, for example, was really very resistant to these kinds of associations of this softness and tactile quality in her work. The kind of reception there and this desire to just kind of go outside of what artists were trying to advocate about their own practice seems to be a common thread in how many critics are discussing these artists.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are no shortage of formal similarities between Tawney's woven hangings and Martin's grids, and I think there's a kind of incontrovertible argument to be made that there was mutual influence, and with the woven collages too. And it's also the case that Agnes Martin wrote the catalog essay for Lenore Tawney's first major show, which was at the Staten Island Museum for Solo show in 1961. And Martin wrote this very beautiful catalog essay for Martin's first published piece of writing. But at the same time, she was extraordinarily resistant to anything that identified her. And there was a fair amount of critical response that included these comparisons to textiles. And, Martin was just absolutely adamant that she not be thought of as a textile artist, because that wasn't a serious art. And indeed, it wasn't taken seriously until, I would say it was well into the early 70s before the fiber arts, textile arts were actually given the same kind of respect that painting was. Same with Navajo blankets. There have been arguments made, and again, I think legitimate arguments, that all of Martin's time in the Southwest and her exposure to Navajo weaving was a really important part of her formation as an artist. But she resisted that connection as well.
And certainly Lenore Tawney, the space afforded to her by this studio in Coenties Slip with such high ceilings with these very hulking beams allowed her to hang her woven forms in a way to really move these pieces beyond the decorative arts, take them away from the wall and into a more sculptural mode. And as you say, it's really kind of the early phases of that, and something that she pushed against but didn't receive so much public understanding until much later in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it's curious to watch the women of this period finding their place, and what they feel they need. The same is true of Louise Nevelson, of course. What they feel they need to do to support their work, and their ambivalence often with respect to what would later be second wave feminism. It wasn't part of the discussion in the early 60s. And it took a long time for women to stop resisting this identity of, being in the ghetto of art by women. Throughout her career, Martin actually resisted anything to do with identity at all. So, we're looking at, just to go back to the slideshow, we're looking at what I think is just such a fascinating, complicated painting by Jim Rosenquist, who lived at the Slip as well, Site C, and it's a kind of unfamiliar work for him, and I think emphasizes how all of the artists in that community were playing with language, and with a kind of punning use of language, and with the tension between visual and verbal imagery. And I've also begun to think that there was something about coded language that was very important for artists like Johns and Rauschenberg and Krissa at a time when reading code was a sort of was a social lifesaver.
Yeah, certainly a social necessity for queer communities to maintain lines of communication while preserving safety in an environment that did not support their lives whatsoever. And it's really interesting to see some of the ways in which that code can be read in parts in pieces like this and in the work of other artists in Coenties Slip and of course beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. So well put. Thank you. This is rather dramatic picture of Krista in her studio. Of course, she was using language on a large scale by the middle 1960s. Another close friend of Martin's, another probable romantic partner of Martin's, and a very forceful personality who sort of had this blazing like a comet presence in the art world in the 60s. She arrived in 1955 in New York City, and within a very small handful of years had a show at Betty Parsons, which came through Martin, and then a solo show at the Guggenheim Museum, and was represented in Dorothy Miller's recent acquisitions at the Museum of Modern Art, also in 1961. She was born in 1933, so she was more than 20 years younger than Martin. Like Martin didn't stay, like Yayoi Kusama, who will also come into this conversation. She didn't stay in New York for very long, but while she was here, her presence was absolutely enormous, and I think sort of explored a different dimension of what it was to use language, in her case, literally in lights often. But this, and here is one of her grids of classified ads from newsprint, from newspapers, which she did both on papers here and also as screen prints on canvas. But here we have her letter F from the show, which is this very peculiar. She did a lot of work that was based on letter forms and on books. Cycladic books was one of her early series of sculptures. And here she's got this big capital letter F made up of what looks a little bit like golf tees if you're close to it. But I also think it has a resemblance to cash register keys, and also perhaps typewriter keys. It's very, very tactile.
Really interesting. I know one thing that we uncovered in the course of our research is Krista's absolute infatuation with Times Square. She, to your point about language, she wrote about how Times Square had more poetry than the Acropolis lit at night. Her love for that space was just unending. And I really like your connection between this and a kind of tactile typewriter keys. When I've looked at it in the past, I've wondered if there is a evocation of lights of Broadway marquees, that each of these protrusions are kind of individual flash bulbs of a sign of a theater name or something like that. But it's interesting to see her exploration in this early period of her career in strictly metal, still speaking to letter forms and lights that, as you say, she would go more explicitly into using and exploring later in her career.
Yeah, I mean, yes, she worked in and around Times Square. She did work based on Times Square, and she really did her best to be lit up herself, saw herself in lights. So that is actually the end of my slideshow, and perhaps this is a good time to move on to other questions that we thought we might address.
Sure. If we're sticking to Krissa for just a moment, I know she had some success at Pace Gallery. We've been thinking a bit about the importance of exhibitions in this period. Many of the galleries run by Jewish gallerists, but also institutional exhibitions and gallery shows throughout the city that provided artists an opportunity to put their work into the public, create a dialogue between their practice and what other artists saw on view, and getting a show as then and as today and then, having an exhibition of one's work was quite important. Krissa, I know, was one of those artists who did have some success with Pace Gallery. She had a first show in 1966, I believe, and another in 1968. Perhaps could you speak a bit more about her relationship with that gallery?
You know, there was a great deal of socializing that not at the beginning of the Coenties Slip moment as in our community, but by the end of the 60s, the art world and, you know, in its social life had certainly gone down below 9th Street, below 10th Street to Johns and Rauschenberg and all the things that were happening there. And Arnie Glimcher did come to some social events in that community. He met Krissa, and of course, by that point, she had already had some success gaining attention, you know, at museums. But he, I think, was put off by the force of her personality. I'm looking for a quote, and yes, I found it. He said that Krissa, who like Martin had schizophrenia, was much more violently psychotic than Agnes. So that's the quote. Their mental illness, unlike Kusama's mental illness, was something that really wasn't talked about at the time, and certainly not by Martin, certainly not by her close friends, and not by Arnie Glimcher either until much, much later. They didn't talk about it. Of course, the culture as a whole suppressed that conversation. But you can't help wondering whether this, more violently psychotic than, little phrase, just also, and other critics referred to her violent temper as well. Pierre Estany did in his favorable critical response to Krissa. It was just, a woman with too much personality, a woman too outspoken with too much power. It's hard to reconstruct if you haven't been part of the scene yourself, and I was not. But from what I've heard from people who were, she was a challenging personality. She perhaps was one of these people that may have been, maybe called their own worst enemy. But she was also a very powerful artist. And yeah, so the association with Pace didn't last.
Yeah, and of course, this idea that a woman might be too much is something that we see over and over again, not only then, but today, and is perhaps just one of the many barriers that women artists in this period faced. Critiques of their physique, of their types of art practice, of innumerable things that people, often male gallerists and dealers, put forward as a reason perhaps why. And we have heard innumerable stories of women artists feeling that perhaps their art was not good enough because they didn't see the kind of public reception and support that their male counterparts were getting. I think one perhaps interesting example, and not maybe exception, I think it's a slightly more complicated discussion than that, continues with Pace Gallery. Certainly not to villainize them in any way, but just they were a gallery that was of great importance in this period and really supporting many of the artists that our projects, respectively, both are interested in. The thing that I'm thinking of here is an exhibition organized by Arnie Glimsher and Fred Muller in 1964, the first international Girlie Exhibition. This is an exhibition that included the work of 10 artists, 8 men and 2 women, and asked artists to consider the legacy of the pinup girl in popular culture. And I wonder if you might be able to talk through a bit of your understanding of the significance of that exhibition, or your reaction to its kind of place in history.
Yeah, so I will admit I wasn't aware of that exhibition until I saw your entry about it in the fantastic exhibition catalog, which I enjoyed immensely. And, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Lucy Lepard's celebration of Agnes Martin in an article she put together about the square, about and her association through several exhibitions, Martin's association with minimalism, which she was at first sort of hesitant about, and then, later flat out said, oh, that was a mistake, so I guess I'm getting to the question of how Marjorie Strider and Rosalind Drexler wound up being in this girly show, but also, so I've puzzled over this show, the compromises, the adjustments that women make in order to be seen, and frankly, to be seen with men, to be considered part of rather than an exception to the community. And, just thinking how late in this period feminism actually emerged. Right. So, the sexual revolution, that all of the license that came with the pill, with, with the new tolerances of the early 1960s, which are so much part of the culture at that time. Of course, you had to be straight to experience it at all. And really, you had to be male to get, a full sense of what sexual revolution permitted. In fact, second wave feminism, I think, was largely driven by all of the liberation movements of the time, excluding or abusing women who were associated with it. So the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, sexual liberation movement were driven by men. And ultimately, women found that if they wanted to have their rights, our rights represented, it was going to have to be in a movement of it, of its own. So, the girly show seems a kind of a piece with the kinds of celebrations of eroticism, of youth, of energy that were part of the time, as this exhibition so well illustrates, but also were part of other, modernist movements in the earlier years of the 20th century. If you think of surrealism, and there, the ways that women were seen within the surrealist vocabulary, and, the kind of naughtiness, the kind of interest in being provocative that is part of so many vanguard movements, the youthfulness, the just that.
Yeah, I think the inspiration purportedly for this exhibition came from the directors at Pace Gallery seeing the work of one artist, Marjorie Strider, one of the 2 women included. Her pieces most often used a relief technique where she would build out parts of these figurative compositions. Often her figures were very stylized depictions of women. She would build out the breasts, she would build out the eyelashes, the lips, different parts of their body, really kind of directly poking at this idea of a passive gaze, of objectification. And for her, this was really a distinctly critical and satirical approach to imagery in men's magazines. And while that was the kind of jumping off place for this exhibition, we know that many of the artists in that show weren't always quite so critical or overtly critical. This is, always the line that pop artists are walking. Is it laudatory? Is it critical? Is it ambiguous? It kind of sits somewhere in the middle. Andy Warhol and Tom Wesselman, for example, both worked for Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine. They contributed illustrations and other commissions. So this dialogue between commercial depictions of women and depictions of women in art at a gallery, which itself is commercial, often does kind of play into this blurry understanding of depictions of women in the public sphere. I know critics from the period didn't quite know what to make of it. The New York Herald Tribune was kind of shocked by it in some senses. The review said, enjoy it if you can, but if it fails to amuse, just forget it. There was really this kind of questioning of pop art, even in 1964, when I think it had an increased presence in New York City at that point. But it's interesting to think about the ways in which women artists in particular were often asked to create work of a certain kind of mode. Lee Montague is another artist whose work critics of the time often tried to ascribe feminist connotations to, which she often had to go back and say, this is not the intention of my work. This is not what my work is about. Just because I am a woman does not mean that that's what my piece has to be about. I wonder if in your research you have found that there is an expectation for women artists, queer artists, any kind of artists that fit outside of the straight white male kind of category to be making work of a certain kind, if it always had to speak to some things, if you've seen a kind of common thread there at all.
I think not. I think mostly what is evident in the show and what my sense of the period and succeeding decades has been is that there's so much more diversity than traditional histories tend to suggest, and that there's so much contradictory stuff going on all the time. And women like men find themselves in shows or volunteer themselves for shows that don't necessarily represent the thrust of their work, but instead are simply an opportunity for them to get the work seen and, hopefully considered on its merits, right? I'm thinking about a show that I contributed to organizing as part of the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program in 1977, called Out of the House. And this was when the Whitney had a branch actually very close to Coenties Slip in 55 Water Street's lobby gallery. It's a period when there was a lot of vacant real estate in New York, and realtors, developers were looking for art to, make it look lively. And so the idea behind this show was to highlight artists who are doing work that was involved with domesticity and housework, to be more blunt about it. Merle Euclides was part of the show. A lot of artists turned us down, and we were considering only women artists, and they turned us down because they felt that the struggle was over, and they were tired of being ghettoized, and they wanted to move forward, independent of being identified as feminist artists, as artists whose concerns were identical to those of feminism, 1977. And Marjorie Strider said, yeah, absolutely. I've got, I know what work you want, and I'd be delighted. It was a relief that had to do with a broom and sweeping away debris. It was a very, as her work was, it was a very spirited, funny, powerful statement. So yeah, I mean, I'm so interested to hear about the response to Girlie Show. Of course, it doesn't seem a comfortable fit with the gallery that Glimcher went on to build, but
yeah, I know Marjorie Strider had 2 more shows at Pace Gallery in 1965 and 1966, where she would continue to explore this relief technique. But she was, as you said, a very energetic and ambitious artist. She jumped from mode to mode and really shifted her practice in a number of ways that I think sometimes the kind of gallery world didn't quite understand. And this kind of brings me to another artist who you mentioned just in passing, and I'm hoping we can talk a bit more about, which is Yayoi Kusama, another artist who was living and working in New York City, sharing a building with Donald Judd, living in the same space. Not in the same space, and living in the same building, and not always finding the same kinds of connections and support that Judd, for example, found with Green Gallery. I wonder if you could talk about Kusama's practice and her kind of role or place in this milieu.
Yeah, I've thought a little bit about her relationship or her affinities with Agnes Martin. I really don't know that much about Kusama's exhibition history or the history of her gallery representation in this period, but she was in New York for roughly the same period of time that Martin was, and like Krissa, like Martin, she ultimately found it insupportable. I mean, it just wasn't the life for her. And as everyone knows, she returned to Japan and installed herself in a residential psychiatric community where she has flourished for these many years. So I think that they have strong connections. Formally, I found it curious that the Metropolitan Museum has hung, perhaps the installation is still up, their work side by side, an infinity net next to a grid. And, I think it's an illuminating comparison, and also helps suggest their differences. For Martin, the grid was always bounded. It was an ordering system that was fixed within a tightly controlled and very meditative space. And, as the term infinity nets suggests, for Kusama was the opposite. I mean, her whole aesthetic is about annexing everything into a system of nets or phalluses or polka dots, or there's absolutely no boundary around her work. And of course, by the end of the 60s, she was doing extremely provocative performance work on the streets, in front of the Museum of Modern Art, with performers who were nude and, painted in polka dots. And she also had a very extroverted relationship to her own autobiography. Martin was very, very determined to keep biography out of the consideration of her work, which, seems like it belongs to another millennium, which of course it does, and just another worldview from the way criticism and art history proceeds now. But Kusama, in that respect and in others was very different from the start. Yeah.
It's interesting what you're saying about an artist's relationship to their biography, and certainly your practice and our practice as a kind of curatorial project often have a lot of overlap in trying to contextualize or reconstruct works and meanings and intents of artists, particularly when they are no longer living. I wonder if, as a kind of final note for our discussion today, you might talk through how you approach this in your research, where you turn, how you take these sometimes contradictory statements and interpretations and weave them together.
Yeah, with caution. Yeah, for sure, the landscape of writing about art, of making art, of reception in all of its forms has changed enormously over the period of time that I've been writing. And as you know from reading my book, I first wrote about Agnes Martin as an undergraduate. And at that time, I would have had zero academic support for considering her biography, and nor would I have considered asking her about it. It just would have seemed enormously unprofessional. And in fact, she would have felt, I think, enormously misunderstood if that's where I went. In our single, piece of correspondence. And nonetheless, I undertook a biography. So I think that pretty much suggests the trajectory of my life as a writer, and where we are now. You asked earlier, a discussion before this one, about Lucy Lepard, and her, I feel like there's an implicit comparison, or at least there is one for me, between Lucy on the one hand as someone who's so strongly identified with artists, writing as a friend of artists, writing as an advocate for artists, writing as an activist herself, as a political activist. And somebody like Rosalind Krauss, who dominated my student life, and for whose kind of art writing, for whose immense contribution to art history is premised on the idea that you must develop your ideas in independence of what artists are going to tell you about their work, incorporate it, sure. There's a wonderful memoir, it's not really a memoir, a series of interviews that became a little volume about Craig Owens, in which he talks to Lynn Blumenthal about his development as a critic. And Craig Owens sort of, in the short span of his career as a writer, went through a number of different positions, including, of course, the October position. And, he says in these interviews, at first we were only writing for each other. And so I never wanted to do that. I never wanted to write only for other writers. I think in some respects, the writing about Martin, for instance, I think she was extraordinarily fortunate in the people who wrote about her. So I had a lot, to go back to this question of how I began, I had a lot of excellent critical writing to consider, starting with, really starting with Dory Ashton. What luck, she was one of Martin's first reviewers in the New York Times, and and running the gamut from Hilton Kramer to who was supportive, to writers more active today. And she continues to be an enormous part of Hilton All's, of the critical story. I believe quite firmly that all good writing about art starts in description, starts in reckoning with what we're seeing. And that's why, I'm so interested in this, this sort of thread that I see in the Coenties Slip community of thinking about the relationship between imagery and words, because that is the problem of criticism, right? How to manage the tension between visual art, which really resists words, and our job as curators and writers to put those words, next to that artwork and have it be valuable. So, I guess one way of answering this question, which I've done in a really roundabout way, is, it's all important.
Yeah,
Does that
a
answer the
really,
question at all?
I think a really beautiful encapsulation of the work that we try to do in championing artists, in bringing their work to the foreground. And I guess one way to think about it is as you say, approaching it with caution, with respect, and with confidence for what we are trying to contribute to public knowledge as well. I guess from there, I don't know what better place to leave than such a lovely discussion of your work and your relationship to Agnes Martin's. But thank you so much, Nancy, for speaking with us today, sharing so much of your wonderful research and discussing more about this period, which even after years of working on this project, and certainly for you, years working on Agnes Martin, it's nice to have more discussions about this. There's always more to talk about. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.